Before tonight's horrors unfold, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. Your support keeps the horrors alive. Let's begin. I used to work at this corner pub in a small Minnesota town. More of a bistro, I suppose, but it's always been called a pub. I mostly handled orders, cleaning, and mixing the occasional drink. I was pretty much the only one working there apart from the two owners, an older couple in their 70s. I thought about looking for another job, but the owners had made it clear that if I stayed to help out, I'd be first in line to buy the place for cheap once they retired. It was a good deal, but working in a place like that takes some time getting used to. There are plenty of locals to get to know, and you have to understand who's who and who does what. And while most of these people are harmless and quirky, there was that one couple who just rubbed me the wrong way. I want to share my experience with these people. For some, consider this a warning. For others, it might answer a couple of questions you didn't know you had. Pat and Angela Fisher were a couple of locals who only showed up once per year. They usually kept to themselves. You might spot one of them out shopping for groceries or getting gas for their car. But they weren't really the socializing type. There'd been a lot of speculation as to what their deal really was. Some thought they were religious nutcases, while others thought they might hold some extreme political views. Personally, I wasn't sure. They seemed harmless enough. The Fishers visit our pub once per year. They get dressed up and go out for a bite to eat. Those who've lived in this town long enough know that they do have a daughter, Elena, but that she never goes out with them. Not even on nice nights like this. You can see her as you drive by their house sometimes, but most people had no idea they even had a child. I'd worked at that pub for 5 years when, once again, the Fishers walked in. Pat had dressed up in a brown blazer with a black shirt, while Angela had this plain, white summer dress. And as always, Elena wasn't with them. Still, it seemed to be some kind of special occasion. I walked up to them and tried making some small talk about being dressed up and wished them a lovely evening. They gave me nothing to work with, no hint at what they were doing or why. They just ordered their meal and sat in silence, looking out the window. I snuck back into the kitchen and mentioned it to the owners. They rolled their eyes at me. "They've done this every year since their girl was born," the old woman said. "I think it's a birthday thing." I let my curiosity get the better of me. My final interaction with the couple was casually asking them how Elena was doing. Without skipping a beat, Angela answered. She didn't even look up from the table. "She's fine, everything's fine." And that was that. Discussion over. The Fishers had a simple meal and a glass of red wine each. As soon as they finished, they paid with cash, gave a decent enough tip, and left. They seemed to be in a hurry, so I tried my best not to get in their way. Still, I couldn't help being curious. Everyone knows there is something strange about the Fishers, but no one really knows what or why. As we closed for the night, I cleaned out the booth where the Fishers had been sitting. I noticed something unusual. Angela's purse. She'd put it aside at the beginning of the meal and must have forgotten about it. I was going to return it, obviously, but a part of me couldn't help but to look a bit closer. Maybe there was a hint as to what their deal was. I'm not proud of it, but I rummaged through that purse. But there wasn't much. A written phone number to some guy named Tom, a couple of loose bills, some makeup, tissues, and a couple of hundred in loose bills. That was pretty much it. No phone. I decided I'd give it back to them that same evening. I was feeling a bit guilty about looking through their personal belongings and figured I'd do something nice. Maybe they were just an odd couple. Maybe I was just being judgmental. After my shift, I got in my sky blue Nissan and made my way to the Fishers' house. I see it every time I go to work. It's not too far off my route. It was about 10 p.m. when I stopped in their driveway. I figured I'd just be in and out, so I didn't bother to lock it. I left it in the driveway, along with my take-home leftovers. I left my phone there too. It was charging. The Fishers had a nice home, a large 2-story house with a separate garage and a small guest house out back. I've always loved the color of it, a mellow green with white edges. Kinda clashed a bit with the blue sunflowers in their front garden, though. The moment I reached their door, I could hear a rumble in the sky. It was shaping up to be a rainy night. I looked for a doorbell, but couldn't find one, so I knocked on the door. Something in the air shifted, a sudden lack of sound, as if there'd been a noise coming from inside that I only barely registered, which stopped with my knock. Were they talking? Pat opened the door a bit, but it was stopped by a chain. His eyes went wide. I immediately got the impression that there was some urgency to this. Yes, he said. Just here to give back the Mrs. Purse, I smiled. You forgot it at the... Yes, of course, he interrupted. Thank you. He reached out and grabbed it through the gap in the door. Just as he was about to close the door, I heard the screech of a chair being suddenly moved across the floor. I caught a glimpse of someone. Then the door slammed in my face. I figured that was just Elena in the background, so without thinking too much about it, I blurted out, "Good to see you, Elena. Have a good one." I turned to get back to my car before the rain came, but there was a click at the door. Pat threw the door wide open, calling out to me. "Wait," he said. "Sorry, I was being rude. I'm sorry about that." "No problem," I shrugged. "Y'all have a good one." "No, I can't accept that," he chuckled. "Why don't you come in? We're having some rhubarb pie." "That's all right, but thank you. I'm sure Elena would appreciate the company." I had another look at him, and then back at my car. Every polite bone in my body was screaming at me to just accept, but another part of me just wanted to leave. Even now, I couldn't help but to think there was something off with the Fishers, even at the expense of homemade rhubarb pie. "Tell her I said hi," I smiled and got back in my car. The rain was coming. I saw Pat get back inside the house as I put the keys in and fiddled around with the wipers. I made sure the alarm was off. It can get a bit glitchy at times. Looking straight ahead, I noticed Pat Fisher coming back outside, holding something. Someone was screaming from inside the house. "Honey, wait, she didn't..." Pat Fisher raised a pump-action shotgun, and my ears were ringing before I saw the muzzle flash. I threw my hands up as a barrage of shotgun slugs blew holes into the hood of my car. Moments later, the car door flew open. I was staring down the barrel of a gun with an anxious Pat Fisher on the other end. He was close enough for me to see the specks of rain on his glasses. "Out!" he screamed. "Out! Now!" His wife was standing in the doorway, screaming herself hoarse. I just held my arms over my head, kept my face down, and did as I was told. My ears were screaming. It was as if something inside my ears had been cut by the noise of ripped metal. "We can't do this," Angela screamed. "We can't do this. It's too soon." "What choice do I have?" Pat screamed back. "She saw her. She fucking saw her." It's as if my legs had forgotten they could move, so Pat dragged me out by the ponytail. Cold mud soaked into my pants as my knees hit the ground, and I was pulled up. With a gun barrel pressing into my lower back, he pushed me forward, back towards the house. Now in the moment I couldn't really focus. My mind was running circles around me, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. But looking back at it, there was really nothing to give away just how strange the Fishers really were. There were pictures on the walls, a sign in the kitchen expressing love for the home, neatly vacuumed carpets and well-worn wallpaper. They'd lived there for a long time, and it showed, but in the way that makes you think of a proper home. And now that illusion was shattered. I was pushed to the floor, my muddy jeans staining the flowery hallway carpet. "We got years left, Pat. Years," Angela cried. "We can't do this. Not now." "It's too late, and we're dealing with it," Pat screamed back. "If you just kept her in the kitchen, we wouldn't be." They both quieted down and looked around. Angela hurried down the back corridor into the washing room. Moments later, there was a struggle, someone pleading, and Angela protesting in turn. Pat was anxious to go help, but he couldn't let me out of his sight. Instead, he just stood there, calling out to his wife. Seconds later, Angela returned. She had wrapped her arms around Elena, who looked to be around 14, maybe 15 years old. She had shoulder-length brown hair, a black t-shirt, and a pair of faded jeans. This was probably the first time I'd seen her up close. Elena was screaming at her mother to let her go, While Angela tried desperately to calm her down, hushing and hugging her, Elena was having none of it. There, there, sweet summer child, Angela groaned. There, there. After a short struggle, Elena realized she was going nowhere. For a moment, we all just stopped. The hallway echoed with struggling breaths as we all looked at one another, Angela still having her arms wrapped around her daughter. Upstairs, said Pat. One at a time. Elena looked at Pat in complete disbelief. Then she noticed the shotgun. Her eyes widened. She didn't say anything as the two of us were slowly led upstairs. Angela stayed behind her husband, peering over his shoulder. We'll figure this out, Angela pleaded. It'll be okay. Just give us a minute, okay? Okay? I didn't say anything. I just looked back at Elena, who seemed as confused as I was. We were pushed into a small guest room on the top floor. I could tell someone had been living there for some time. The air was stale. But most notable were the iron bars welded to the window. They had no intention of letting us out of that room anytime soon. The moment we stepped inside, Angela apologized as the door slammed shut. There was a set of locks on the outside, all clicking, one by one. As the rain outside kicked up, we could hear the wind howling. The house groaned as it withstood the pressure, causing little creaks and cracking in the wall and ceiling. Elena sunk down onto her bed, burying her face in her hands. I reached for my cell phone, only to realize I'd left it charging in the passenger seat, right next to my leftover dinner. Do you know these people? Elena asked. It took me a moment to register her question. I looked at her, trying to understand. Yeah, I said. Don't you? Turns out this wasn't Elena Fisher. This was a girl named River. She was 14 years old and originally came from a small community just north of Phoenix, Arizona. She had only known the Fishers for a couple of weeks. Turns out she'd been abducted. She had no idea what was going on, but at least she was unharmed. According to River, there was no one else in the house. There was no Elena, and she couldn't understand why everyone was calling her that. She tried to get out, but the Fishers had the place on lockdown. I have no idea why they're doing this, she admitted. I have no idea. They don't tell me anything. Have they taken anyone else? I asked. Anyone but you or me. She shook her head. But I hear them talking sometimes, she said. Look. She leaned against the far wall, pressing her ear against it. I followed her lead, and I could hear muffled voices from down below. There had to be some sort of ventilation leading past the kitchen, carrying their voices through the walls. Pat and Angela were talking about something being too soon and mentioned something about 4 years left. I tried to piece it together. I looked around the room. It was a repurposed childhood room, it seemed. The wallpaper was still brightly colored butterflies, and there were little notches on the side of the doorframe, the kind you make to check how much someone has grown year for year. But the notches stopped after 3 years. After that, nothing. Considering everything I'd heard about Elena Fisher, she was a pale young girl with shoulder-length brown hair. But that was pretty much the extent of what I knew. River fit that category really well, but so did a lot of girls. They said they would let me go, River explained. I just have to stay a little longer. Did they say how long? A couple of weeks, she sighed. But that was weeks ago. Wait, so you were here all day while they were out for dinner? They locked me in the bathroom, she nodded. They were going to meet someone and then they were going out. Seemed like a big deal. The note in Angela's purse came to mind. This Tom fellow, an accomplice? About half an hour passed. Then suddenly there were footsteps coming up the stairs. I could hear Angela pleading and Pat responding. We can't keep her for 4 years, he yelled back down. We can't. But we can't just... My head was rushing in 3 directions at once. I thought about hiding, attacking, rushing past him. But ultimately, I did nothing. River and I just lined up against the wall, as far away from the door as possible. When Pat entered, I could tell he was unstable. His hands were shaking, and he had the finger on the trigger. You, he said, nodding at me. Out, now. Angela stood to the side, her arms crossed. Pat led me downstairs and out the back door through the washing room. No one said a word. By now the rain was pouring down. My hair got stuck to my face, stinging my eyes. The ground smelled of wet dirt and some sort of chemical. Maybe ammonia. The rain was relentless. I could hear Angela calling something out from the house, but I couldn't hear what. Pat cocked the shotgun and spoke, seemingly to himself. "We've gone too far to stop now," he said. "We can't stop now." I looked up at him only to see the gun pointed my way. This was it. He was doing it. In that final moment, my mind was just racing with possibilities and last-second attempts, but I couldn't bring myself to believe that this was actually happening. I was locked into this role of an onlooker, seeing myself through my own eyes, incapable of believing I was the one on the chopping block. His eyes locked with mine. He was terrified. Angela called out again, and Pat's eyes darted to the side. She repeated something. His eyes wavered as he looked back at her. "What?" "He can use her," she called back. "We can give her to him, and he can use her." Why? Angela was hurrying outside, covering her head with a jacket. As she ran up to Pat, I tried to get out of the dirt, but he just turned his attention right back to me. I couldn't provoke him further. If he can take her, we don't have to worry. We don't have to deal with this." "And what if he doesn't?" "Then we deal with it," Angela nodded. But if we don't have to, that's..." "Yeah, no, yeah," sighed Pat. "Yeah, that's good. We'll do that." As the two of them spoke, I looked around. We were in the backyard. At first I thought it was a garden, but nothing was growing. There were little wooden markers placed in rows of 5, for a total of 10. All of them numbered from 4 to 13. I looked down, pressing my hand into the dirt. Not too far to my right was another marker with a 14 written. The soil there was harder, and there was a shovel resting next to it. What the hell had they done? I was led back inside. Angela was standing off to the side, rocking back and forth. I could tell she was stressed out of her mind. She was looking at something on the wall, a wooden mallet, a one-handed wooden mallet hanging right over the washing machine. It had 10 black notches on the handle, same number as the markers out back. "Sweet summer child," Angela wept. "You're coming home, sweet summer child." I was led back upstairs, and Pat threw a towel at me to dry off with. As I was reunited with River, I couldn't stop myself from weeping. All that fear that I'd been putting off hit me like a truck, and my entire body felt like it was shutting down. It was just this all-consuming, singular-focused fear. To go from this dissociating mindset to the full realization of what had been about to happen is unreal. I told River all I'd seen out there, the markers, the mallet, and taking everything into account, I tried to surmise my thoughts. They were doing something they had done before, possibly as many as 10 times. They were going to do it again, and possibly up to 4 more times. They had some kind of accomplice. All these bits and pieces were starting to paint a picture. River was barely paying attention as she looked out the window, shaking her head. "Don't you get it?" she said shakily. "Just look. What does it look like?" I moved over to the window and looked outside. Neat rows with 5 markers each. It could just be one thing. "Graves," I said. "It looks like graves." We had to do something, anything. And as a bolt of lightning sailed across the sky, River had an idea. We counted down the seconds until we heard the thunderclap. Then, with River as a spotter, we carefully flipped a chair at the far end of the room and got ready. Timed with the next thunderclap, I broke off one of the chair legs, a makeshift weapon, if anything. River pointed out that the storm was moving too much. We had to skip the next strike, as we couldn't figure out the timing, but by the 3rd strike, we broke off one more leg. Leaning against the wall earlier, I realized that it was pretty thin. We took off our shoes and used our chair legs as a sort of chisel. One of the walls was made of gypsum, so there was a chance we might be able to punch a hole into the next room over. But we had to be clever about it. Counting down the seconds, striking at once, and being sure to count every other strike. We had to be slow, methodical, and precise. It took some time, but the storm wasn't going away anytime soon. We managed to punch a small hole through to the next room, just large enough for River to crawl through. Seconds later, she'd gone around and unlocked the door from the outside. I made my way out, quietly. There was no doubt in my mind that Pat would shoot the two of us if he saw us. But before I could do anything else, River showed me to the room she'd crawled into, a small storage space. Apart from the occasional piece of furniture, most of the things in there were meant for a small child or a toddler. I wasn't surprised, but River was pointing at something specific, a pile of picture frames. Elena, 1 year old. Elena, 2 years old. Elena, 3 years old. Then nothing. She didn't make it to 4, River whispered. So, what did they... We both fell silent. There was more to this, but I couldn't figure it out. Not yet. We could hear them talking downstairs. Something about a stranger showing up in the morning. Just one more night, Angela pleaded. Pat wasn't convinced, but reluctantly seemed to agree. As they talked, we considered going through one of the windows. Making our way to the end of the upstairs hallway, we found the Fishers' bedroom, all neatly organized and clean. We snuck up to the window and cracked it open. Using my arm, I helped River climb out. She had to do a bit of a jump, but it wasn't all too bad, and she landed in soft soil. But as I turned to climb out, I could hear the conversation downstairs was ending. They were moving around. I pointed at River and waved her off, silently begging her to go get help. Then I shut the window and hurried back to the room. There was no time. I had to hide. I propped up my jacket and a pillow in the bed in the room to make it look like River was sleeping, and I hid the broken chair behind the door. I figured if I stood far enough to the right, they wouldn't see the small hole in the wall at ground level. It was a long shot, but it just might work. But as I got back to the room, there was one thing I hadn't counted on: the lock. There was no way for me to lock the door from inside. And before I could even begin to figure it out, Angela came through the door. Angela looked over at the sleeping River and put down 2 plates of something warm, along with 2 bottles of water. She looked at the door a couple of times, as if trying to make sense of what she was looking at. I think she concluded that Pat must have forgotten to lock it, and that we must have missed it. After all, why else would I still be in that room? "It'll be over by morning," Angela whispered. "I'm sorry about all of this." I said nothing. I just grabbed one of the plates, poked around at it, and waited for her to leave. She did, making sure to properly lock the door this time. I figured I'd make another escape attempt, but Angela was waiting right outside. I could have expanded on the hole in the wall and made my way out, but the storm was moving away, and without a clear idea of where they were, I might screw it up. Then again, what choice did I have? About an hour passed. I'd gone through 100 plans in my head, but nothing seemed plausible anymore. That I'd gotten River out at all was nothing short of a miracle, one not very likely to be repeated. But there was a sound that snapped me out of my thoughts. A car alarm. My car alarm. Did River start it? My keys were still in the ignition after all. Moments later, there was chaos outside. Someone scrambling up and down the stairs, shouting, a door slamming. I used the diversion to punch through the hole in the wall to the storage room, making my way out into the hallway. The path was clear. I decided to head for the back door. I didn't want to jump from a window and get a sprained ankle unless absolutely necessary. If I had to get away in a hurry, an injury would be a death sentence. Peeking around the corner, the stairs were clear. I hurried downstairs through the washing room and out the back door, only to end up face to face with Angela Fisher, standing in the rain. For a moment, we just looked at one another. We didn't know what to do. My instinct was to run. Hers was to call for help. But as soon as she opened her mouth, all that came out was this awful crunching noise. I hadn't noticed River sneaking up on her, wielding the garden shovel. Angela got the back of her head bashed in. It was like turning off a light, and she just fell, face forward, straight into the dirt, not too far from the 14 marker. There was no time to think. I grabbed River by the hand and beelined for the woods. We barely made it to the tree line before I heard this painful death wail. You never forget that kind of scream, the emotional equivalent of having your heart torn out of your chest. Pat had found his wife. Holding River by the hand, we made our way through the underbrush and into the woods. The rain made every branch, root, and rock slippery. Leaves stuck to my face and clothes, but we pressed on. Every now and then, we'd hear a distant scream, sometimes coming closer, other times seeming impossibly far away. And then a gunshot. We threw ourselves to the ground, covering our heads. We crawled to safety behind a large rock, listening intently to where the shot came from. Pat was rambling, screaming, really to himself. One life for every year. That's what he wanted, he cried. 1 year until she'd be old enough to care for herself. To care for herself where we couldn't. We've made it so far. You can't take this away from us. You can't. You can't. River held my arm tight as we listened. We could barely hear anything over the rain, but I could tell the general direction. He was coming our way. He comes every year, and every year we do it right. We've done it right. We've done everything right. He was getting closer. River and I looked at one another, but there was nowhere left to go. Just getting up would expose us. All we could do was stay down and wait, hoping for Pat and the storm to pass. But we weren't so lucky. Pat stepped out next to us, panting like an animal. He turned to us, as if knowing exactly where we were hiding. Despite the rain, I could tell he'd been crying. He raised the shotgun towards us yet again, wailing like a wounded animal. Click. Nothing. Maybe he forgot to cock it. Maybe he was out of slugs. Either way, our hearts skipped a beat, and I burst into action. I grabbed River's shovel, got up, and swung for the fences. The shovel connected with Pat's hand, breaking 3 fingers. A moment later, we were in an all-out brawl. Punching, kicking, biting, strangling. And it wasn't over until River finished it with a large rock coming down on his head. Only then could I hear the rain again, but my ears kept ringing with Pat's wailing scream, long after he went quiet for the last time. I can still hear it if I listen close enough. It was a long walk, a desperate call for help, but by morning we were safe. Now, I'm sure some of you have heard of this. Maybe it rings a bell. The articles talked about an isolated couple who had no less than 10 bodies buried on their property, a mad way of grieving for a lost child who never made it to 4 years old. Most of the articles didn't mention kidnappings or how they were killed. I never saw my name, or River's, thankfully. There was one statewide newspaper who mentioned 2 bystanders being responsible for bringing this to the authorities' attention. Last I heard of River, she was reunited with her family back in Arizona. I'm still working at the pub. This all took place some time ago, and I've done my best not to talk too much about it or dwell on it. I still get panic attacks thinking about that gun pointed at my face, and I can still hear wailing screams at night. But apart from that, I'm okay, at least physically. But not too long ago, a man walked in. I hadn't seen him before, but he was impossible to miss. The man was at least 6 feet 7 inches and wore all black. White hair and these intense, terrifying blue eyes. He had lunch, introducing himself as Tom, and asked me a couple of brief questions about the Fishers. As he finished up, he smiled at me, leaving me with a final cryptic message. Some folks will do anything for their sweet summer child,